So, hello everyone, we are back making this puff pastry now. Our dough and butter block have been in the fridge for about an hour so they can really chill and relax. And we're going to get started on the roll out portion of this. And so, I'm going to start with my dough. And you'll notice the dough has chilled down, it's a little bit more pliable now. It's softened up, that gluten has had time to relax. So I just want to unwrap it from its parchment paper. And I'm just going to pop it onto a nicely floured surface. Our dough is cold, so it's not super sticky or tacky anymore, but getting a little bit of flour down is going to really help with our rollout. And so the other thing I've got is my butter block. And our goal with this dough is to lock our butter in, but we need our dough to be a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to roll out my dough, and I'm going to go for around 10 to 12 inch squares on this dough. And so I want to keep this dough as square as possible. So I'm only rolling in two directions. I'm rolling this way, I rotate 90 degrees, and I'll roll the other direction. And again, trying to keep everything nice and flat and even. So if you're seeing, oh, this part looks a little thicker, try to roll that side a little bit more. They see me rolling. And so we're just rolling this out so it's a little bit bigger than our butter block. If it's the same size as our butter block, it can be hard to get that butter block locked in, which means kind of getting it covered in the dough. So we want it a little bit bigger. My goal is that as I kind of take these two edges up, I can meet them in the middle of that butter block. And so I'm going to roll this dough out just until we get to that point. And so we'll keep rolling. We want it about 1.5 times the size of our butter block. So that's probably towards the 12-inch size on this. As you're doing this, you can always add a little bit more flour, but try to keep everything nice and square. And so we've got a nice, fairly square piece of dough going on. And I just want to check my butter block one more time. So I'm going to set it in, offset it so that it's at a 45-degree angle. Center points are pointing towards the center of our dough. And I just want to see, can I lock it in? Do I have enough dough that this is going to fit over? And right now I'm looking at it. I'm at that point where I can kind of squeeze the edges together. If you had a big gap or something, you'd want to keep rolling this. But I'm seeing it looks good. So again, we went for about 12 inches, around 12, maybe 14 inches, really just depending on the size of your butter block here. And so we can go ahead and unwrap our butter block and start locking this in. With your butter block, the one thing you want to double check is that it has a little pliability to it. So if your butter is super solid, you can't bend it at all, you want to let it sit for another 5-10 minutes until it has a little flexibility in that. What that's going to allow it to do is roll out. If you have a really, really firm butter in there, when you start rolling out, all of that butter is going to crack and it's not going to layer nicely. You'll have a kind of rougher puff pastry. So by making sure you've got that little bit of flexibility, you can kind of do the wave with your butter block. That tells me, okay, my dough is a-okay over here. And so we're going to go ahead and unwrap our butter block. And just pop it into our dough. Again, kind of getting it in the center. The corners of our butter are in the centers of our dough. And then I'll just take each corner and kind of pull it in. I'm pulling it in, getting it over. There's a little overlap, that's a-okay. We want to make sure none of that butter escapes though. And then I'm just going to come in with my fingers and pinch everything together. This pinch together is really going to help seal that butter in and ensure that as we are bringing this dough together, none of that butter is seeping and squirting out. And so I kind of pinched and crimped, and now I'm just going in with my hand to kind of flatten. You can go in with a rolling pin and just kind of flatten that out. And that's our lock in. So our butter is now locked into the pastry. We have a layer of dough, we have a layer of butter, and another layer of dough. So this is 3 layers, but as I said earlier, millefeuille means 1,000 layers. So we're gonna fold this again and again and again until we get hundreds and hundreds of layers. And so I went ahead, the lock-in side is down on my workstation. I'm gonna sprinkle with some flour all over, and I'm just gonna start rolling this dough out. Again, if your butter is feeling firm and it's really not pliable, give it a minute or so to warm up. My dough is still ultra cold, but that butter is pliable. That's the most important thing. And you'll see, as you're rolling this out, it's rolling out nice and smooth. The butter is kind of spreading out, and that's what we want. As I'm doing this, I'm gonna go in with my hands and just shape this up a little bit, kind of keep things nice and rectangular. We're gonna get a nice roll going on. My goal as I'm rolling is to get a nice long sheet of dough that I can fold in onto itself. And one of the more important things when you're doing this is the heft of the dough. So I'll give you a dimension on the recipe saying roll it out to this length, but the heft of the dough or the thickness of the dough is what's most important. If you're feeling like, oh, my dough is really thick, you got to keep rolling. You want this to get down to between around a 1/4 inch thick. That's going to thin out the butter enough that we're going to get the lamination. If you don't roll it out enough, you're never going to get that butter thin enough that it laminates. So getting a nice thin roll on here is going to be really, really important for that lamination process. As you're doing this, if you see any little air bubbles forming in here, now is a good time to go in and prick those. You can use a pin, a toothpick, or you can go in with a little fork and just make sure you prick those air bubbles and press out any little bits of air that could have been locked in. The air will get a little bit funky as this bakes. And so this size I'm going for is approximately 2 to 3 feet by about 1 foot. And you can use a ruler and be super precise with this. I'm never ultra precise about my dimensions this way or this way, because sometimes it rolls out differently. But the main thing I'm looking for is the thinness on that dough. So that 1/4 to 1/8 inch thickness on that dough. That is the most important dimension you can have as you're rolling this out. As you're rolling, make sure you're constantly flouring, making sure that surface is nice and non-stick. Trying to keep as even of a rectangular shape as possible. And so I've rolled out my dough. I've got that about 2 feet by about 1 foot. Again, doesn't have to be perfectly exact, but I'm feeling the heft of my dough, and it feels like it's around a 1/4 inch. You can use a ruler to check that, but it's around a 1/4 inch. As you work with dough more, you'll get a feel for it where you can just have your hands underneath and you'll know this feels correct. The one last thing that I really like to do is just trim my edges. And so on my edges, they're not perfectly square. And that's fine. You can definitely use it with an unsquare edge, but squaring off the edge will just get it a little bit more perfect. So I'm just going to use a knife and just slice off the littlest amount from my edge, trying to get it a little bit straighter. And again, this is an optional step. I've done it without this and it turns out beautifully. But to get perfect puff pastry, you can cut those edges a little bit, just trim them up. And you can see in this dough, you already see that kind of layering going on. You see one layer of butter surrounded by 2 layers of dough. And so we're going to start our folding process. So I like to take a pastry brush, just brush off my dough, making sure there's no flour. And I'm going to do what's called a book fold. So I'm going to take one edge, fold it into the middle. My other edge is getting folded into the middle as well. We'll meet them in the middle. Once they're met, I'll go in with my brush one more time, make sure there's no little floury bits, and then I'll fold this in half. So that's our book fold. And then to roll this out again, I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees and roll out this direction now. So we're getting a little structure built in this dough by doing that as well. And so we'll roll this again and repeat the rolling process 3 more times. So we'll have a total of 4 folds on this dough. And depending on your dough, you may want to wait and roll it a little bit later. My dough's getting a little bit soft and it's starting to warm up. So I'm going to see if I can roll it out. But if I feel it's getting really warm and kind of sticky and it's not wanting to roll out, I'll give it a rest for 30 minutes before I roll out again. And so you can do 2 rolls at a time. If it's getting really soft, you can kind of take a minute, let it rest in the refrigerator for 30 minutes, and then repeat the rolling process. So again, we're doing a total of 4 rolls on this puff pastry. So that first fold we just did, I've got 3 more folds to do. Make sure between you're resting if that butter's getting soft. If the gluten is starting to make that dough stretch back into itself, that's another sign. Rest the dough. When I'm resting the dough, I'll give it a wrap in plastic wrap so that it stays nice and fresh. So I'm going to get these last rolls done over here and rest it, and then I'll show you what the dough should look like when we are ready to go into class. And so my dough, I went ahead, did those 3 additional folds, and it looks really nice. Now, as you keep doing it, it kind of gets smoother and smoother, looks better and better. So I've got it, did that last fold. I'm just going to grab some plastic wrap now. Pop my dough onto the plastic wrap, wrap it nice and tightly so that no air can get to this dough. Air is the enemy of dough, it'll dry it out. So we want to keep this nice and tightly wrapped. I'm going to pop it onto my sheet tray and just get this into my fridge. And I'll let that dough chill overnight. Once it's had that overnight chill, we'll go ahead and use it tomorrow as we make our millefeuille, our delicious pastry. But it is such a fun pastry to make. You can make this again and again. Save any extra dough that you're not going to use immediately in your freezer. Otherwise, in the refrigerator, you've got about 3 to 5 days till it starts to oxidize and get little kind of gray colorations on it. With those gray colorations, on the first day it happens, it's not a huge deal if you roll it out that day and bake it off into whatever you want. The gray kind of disappears, but as you keep it sitting, that gray kind of magnifies and it starts affecting the flavor. So just be careful with that, but it is a beautiful dough. I can't wait to make millefeuille with you tomorrow. So see you in a little bit. Bye everyone.